So welcome everybody. This is the third talk in the series, What Happens When We Die. And this week and next week, I'm going to be looking at the question, is rebirth true? And in these two talks, I'm not setting out to convince you of the case for rebirth. Neither am I hoping to convince you that rebirth is not true. Instead, what I would like to do is to place before you what Sangharakshita carefully calls considerations for you to reflect on. And at the outset, I need to emphasize that, in my opinion, there is no right or wrong answer on this issue. It's a matter of personal choice and belief. You can be a Buddhist and not be a believer in rebirth, or you can be a Buddhist agnostic, content to not know what happens when we die, but importantly, remaining open to different possibilities. Or, of course, you may believe in rebirth. But whatever your own position, it's important, I think, to be aware of the issues and debates about rebirth. It's important not to adopt a fixed view such that you insist that your chosen view is the only true one and all other views are false. We should carefully assess and reflect on what Sangharakshita calls considerations. So my first consideration is a question. When and where in the history of humanity did ideas of rebirth or reincarnation emerge? And when and where did ideas of rebirth become connected to ethical behavior? And to try to answer this question, I'm going to rely very much on an account developed by a man called Gananath Obesekri. He's a professor emeritus of anthropology at Princeton University and one of the world's leading anthropologists. And Obesekri published his account of these issues in 2002 in a book entitled Imagining Karma, Ethical Transformation in Amerindian, Buddhist, and Greek Rebirth. And Obesekri challenges the common conception that the sole origin of the idea of rebirth was to be found in India. And in his book, he shows how ideas of rebirth arose separately across a wide range of pre-literate cultures involving small-scale indigenous societies in places such as West Africa, Melanesia, that's the islands of the Southwest Pacific, North America, and ancient tribal India. And across these different cultures arose a basically similar model of rebirth. At birth, a person is transferred from some other invisible world to this visible world, a world of suffering. And when the death occurs of that person, the correct funeral rites ensure that the person is returned to the invisible world where there is freedom from suffering. However, the stay in that other invisible world is temporary, again ending with rebirth in this suffering world. At this stage of the development of the model of rebirth, there is an absence of any role for ethics. The cycle of birth, death, rebirth happens to a person irrespective of the ethical quality of their actions in this world. There is no karma in the original ideas of rebirth. And in support of the above model, Obesekri cites empirical cases from groups such as the Igbo in West Africa, the Trobriand Islanders near New Guinea, and North American West Coast Indians and Inuit. In these societies, the reborn child is an ancestor who has returned and will eventually die, only to be reborn again in an eternal recurrence. But later in history, with the development of larger scale societies, such as those on the Ganges plains in northern India, ideas of karma and ethical norms begin to appear and transform the rebirth model. Actions in this life are judged as good or bad, ethical or unethical, skillful or unskillful in Buddhist terms, and the quality of these actions is rewarded or punished in other existences after death. And this means that the worlds that occur in the following existences must be, as a minimum, split between a world of retribution, a hell, and a world of reward, a heaven. And in India, out of this develops concepts of samsara, with a variety of different realms or worlds in which rebirth takes place. And after that develops the question of how to escape from the eternal cycle of birth and death and suffering, how to achieve nirvana. And Obasicary argues that the Indians were not alone in what he describes as the ethicization of rebirth. He argues that ethicized rebirth thinking was present in the theorizing of some Greek thinkers in the 6th century BCE. I am not a great expert on the detail of that, but I was surprised to read that until the mid-19th century, people who were vegetarians were not called vegetarians, they were called Pythagoreans, because Pythagoras promoted the idea that people were reborn as animals, and therefore it was not a good idea to eat animals. There's something to muse on there. But the question is, why did the shift to the development of larger scale societies lead to this process of the ethicization of rebirth? And a possible line of explanation goes like this. In small scale societies where people lived very close to each other, anyone who acted against the prevailing group ethical norms would be quickly identified and appropriately punished. Justice would be seen to be done. People could believe in a just world or universe. But with the development of larger scale societies comes a potential loss of certainty in justice. Without the checks and balances of small scale society, it becomes possible to evade responsibility for your actions. And with that comes a question in people's minds. Why is it, if there really is justice in this world, in the universe, that the wicked never get appropriately punished and the good never get sufficiently rewarded? And combining the idea of rebirth with the idea of retribution or reward in a future existence for actions committed in this life seems to ensure that everyone eventually gets what's coming to them either in this life or the next. So according to this historical perspective, it is people's desire or need to believe that the universe is just that is driving the intertwining of the ideas of rebirth and the playing out of ethical or karmic consequences in future existences. So in relation to this desire to believe that the universe is just, I'd like to tell you about a man that I met just over 20 years ago in Birmingham. Professor John Hick was probably one of the most influential philosophers of religion of the 20th century and a specialist on global religion. He was a practicing Christian, though he was twice accused of heresy. And he was also believed by the then Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became the Catholic Pope Benedict between 2005 and 2013. He was also believed by him to be the source of malignant influences on the church. So he's a bit of a rebel. He died in 2012 when he was 90 years old, though he was actively engaged, exploring and writing on spiritual matters right until his death. And going back in time, in 1974, in Sri Lanka, John Hick met and learned about Buddhism and its beliefs from Nyanaponika Thera, the Theravada monk who became the co-founder of the Buddhist Publication Society and was a mentor to Bhikkhu Bodhi, the foremost translator into English of the Pali Canon. Nyanaponika Thera worked with Bhikkhu Bodhi on translation of the numerical discourses of the Buddha. He wrote a famous manual called The Heart of Buddhist Meditation, and he was the co-author of one of my favorite books on Buddhism, Great Disciples of the Buddha. And getting to know and become friends with Nyanaponika Thera, John Hick said, was to his great spiritual profit. Now, I very much respect John Hick as a writer and thinker on spiritual matters. If you're interested in finding out more about him, he's written a very accessible book called The Fifth Dimension. But it's what he said in Birmingham in 2002 in a talk on rebirth and karma that's relevant to the discussion that I'm putting forward today. He said this in Birmingham: most Westerners, whether they accept or more often reject the idea of a life after death, think in terms of an eternal heaven and hell. For most Easterners, on the other hand, what they either accept or reject is the idea of a journey through many lives. Which of these options is for us the standard idea to be either accepted or rejected depends in the great majority of cases on where we were born. However, philosophy, in contrast to theology, tries to transcend this global postcode lottery. And he goes on, it seems to me, given the possibility of more life than the present one, then from a religious point of view, the Eastern model is to be preferred. For at the end of this very short life, few, if indeed any, are ready for either eternal bliss or eternal punishment. But on the other hand, all are ready for further growth and development. And if such a process is indeed taking place, we are all clearly at an early stage in it. If it is to proceed, it requires further interactions with others within a common environment. And he concludes, it seems that this must take the form of further mortal lives lived within the boundaries of birth and death, because it is the inexorable pressure of these boundaries that gives life the urgency that an unlimited, horizonless future would lack. And the cosmic scenario that best meets these requirements is some form of the concept of rebirth or reincarnation. So that was his argument. So I wrote to John Hick in 2004 and was fortunate to be invited to his house to meet with him in Birmingham alone for a very, very English tea and biscuits and a chat. He wheeled out this little trolley with really nice cups and tea and stuff like this. It was lovely. Now, I don't remember all the detail of our discussion, but two things in particular I do remember from that conversation. First of all, he found it difficult, despite the teachings from Nyanaponika Thera, to practice the mindfulness of breathing meditation. And I gave him some advice, but I don't know how helpful that was. But second, towards the end of our discussion, we were talking about belief in rebirth and karma. And I'm certain from our discussion that his belief in the truth of rebirth and karma was much stronger than mine. He held to the view he expressed in his talk in Birmingham in 2002. But right at the end of the discussion about rebirth and karma and a just universe, he paused, gave a little smile, and looked at me saying, "Of course, it could just be wishful thinking. Of course, it could just be wishful thinking." I liked his honesty. Now, I'm taking time to emphasize this because we do need to recognize, I think, how the wish for there to be more time and space to develop, and how the wish for there to be justice in the universe may condition our beliefs and our dispositions. So coming at this issue from a related but different perspective, some argue that it was the emergence of religion with its teachings linking actions in this life with the quality of life in future existences that enabled the development of larger scale societies. Without the glue of such religious belief systems, it's argued, larger scale societies would have disintegrated. So that's some general background discussion on the development of ideas of rebirth and its ethicization within the history of humanity. That's important, I think. Good, important background. But I want to turn now to discussions within the Buddhist world, specifically about rebirth and karma. And according to the Buddhist teaching, it's the quality of our ethical actions, our karma, that drives the journey from one life to the next, that drives rebirths through the realms of samsara. Now, not all Buddhists accept this teaching. Some very explicitly do not accept this teaching. And one prominent Buddhist who states very clearly that he does not accept this teaching is Stephen Batchelor, a leading proponent of what's called secular Buddhism. In his view, the doctrine of karma and rebirth does not hold up. And in support of his view, Stephen Batchelor makes this contention. Even though the Buddha accepted the idea of rebirth, one could argue that he simply reflected the ideologies of his time. The implication is that if the Buddha were alive now, in a more scientific and rational age with different ideologies, rebirth and karma would not be taught by the Buddha. When the Buddha taught rebirth, the argument goes, he was fitting in with one of the dominant ideologies or views of his time. Quite a strong contention to make. And Bhikkhu Analayo has written about this and disagrees very strongly with Stephen Batchelor. He's written about it in his book on rebirth in early Buddhism and current research. And there he argues that detailed study of the early teachings shows how the Buddha actively discovered for himself an experience of rebirth and karma. This the Buddha did through consistent meditation, practice, and reflection, coming to fruition in the very night that he gained enlightenment. Analayo tells us that according to the early Buddhist discourses, there are residual memories that can be carried over from one existence to another. And though these residual memories are not usually remembered in the normal waking state, they can be retrieved through the cultivation of deep states of concentration and mindfulness. Such cultivation, Analayo goes on, would enable access to what normally appear to be the subconscious regions of the mind. So the Buddha himself is said to have developed this ability on the night of his awakening. In the Bhayabhairava Sutta, the Buddha describes his own detailed recollection of past lives which occurred during the first watch on the night he gained enlightenment. Analayo argues that this in turn implies that the realization of the doctrine of rebirth is considered the outcome of an insight that is replicable through meditative practice rather than being just a metaphysical speculation. And in the second watch of the night of his awakening, the Buddha reportedly proceeded from having recollected his own past lives to exploring the passing away and being reborn of other beings. And in this way, he was able to ascertain the driving force causing living beings to migrate through the round of births and deaths. This driving force is karma. The Buddha reports this: I saw living beings of various types being born and passing away, of good or bad appearances, in good or bad destinies, attractive or ugly, in accordance with their good or bad conduct. The Buddha witnessed that those who had acted in unwholesome or unskillful ways were reborn or rebecame in bad realms of existence, and those who had acted in wholesome or skillful ways were reborn in good realms of existence. So Analayo summarizes the Buddha's teaching like this: in this way, the vision of rebirth and the vision of the principle of karma are clearly presented as integral aspects of the Buddha's progress to awakening. According to the testimony of the early discourses, his awakening took place after he had cultivated recollection of his own past lives and had observed how other beings pass away and are reborn in accordance with their previous deeds. And he concludes that the interacting doctrines of rebirth and of karma are therefore an integral and essential component of early Buddhist thought. The doctrines of rebirth and karma, he says, cannot be reduced to a taking over of popular notions from the ancient Indian background. Batchelor's argument, Analayo says, that the Buddha simply went along with the prevailing ideology on rebirth and karma is therefore a weak proposition. Just to add, in that book, Analayo just says, whatever you think about the arguments about rebirth, the key thing is, how do you live your life now? He stresses that very much. Now, Stephen Batchelor, to be fair to him, does present other detailed grounds for arguing that rebirth is not true. For example, he argues there is no empirical proof for the doctrine of rebirth and karma. And next week, I'll be exploring arguments around that for and against the existence of rebirth and karma. But I'd like to add one final point from Stephen Batchelor's reflections for your consideration. Although he does critically dismiss the doctrines of karma and rebirth, seeing them as unverifiable and unneeded in modern times, he nevertheless does recognize the important role these doctrines played in the past. He writes this: this critical assessment of the doctrines of rebirth and karma risks overlooking a crucially important role that they have played in historical Buddhist cultures. To dismiss them as unverifiable metaphysical beliefs of a former age fails to recognize how they served to situate human life within a vision of the cosmos. Rather than conceiving of one's life as a brief flicker of self-interested consciousness on the surface of the earth, people with these beliefs could see in the mythic language of the time, how all beings are intimately connected to a complex series of causal conditions that preceded their existence, as well as to a seemingly infinite unfolding of future consequences for which each was in some small way responsible. In providing a sense of humility, connectedness, and responsibility, this worldview encouraged people to consider the significance of their existence in the selfless context of the immensity of life itself, not reduce it to the service of their egotistical greed and hatred. Imagining thus, he says, we can begin to appreciate the grandeur of these beliefs. These beliefs evoke a vision that is both magnificent and tragic. And he says, there is poetry in this cosmic dance. Beings emerge and disappear infinitely, linked together in an infinite web of interactions. It's beautiful writing that contrasts, however, with something that he then adds. I mean, it is still good writing, but it doesn't have that sort of poetic side of the writing. He adds this: a sense of the sublimity and interconnectedness of life does not require now retaining or reverting to the cosmological beliefs of ancient India. Secular modernity provides an entirely adequate alternative. The vision of life that has been revealed during the past 2 centuries by the natural sciences more than compensates for the loss of pre-modern religious world views. Very strong and contentious statement, but important statement. Now, whether secular modernity does provide an entirely adequate alternative is a very contentious issue, and it's up to you to decide whether you think that's true or not. In addition, I would say, the view that the natural sciences have provided an accepted vision of life is very much contended, particularly by some authoritative philosophers, scientists, and others, particularly when it comes to issues around matter and consciousness. And I'll be turning to these in the next few weeks. So I think what I'm trying to put over in this talk is that there are different themes. History of how rebirth and karma emerged. Is there a desire for a just society? What role did rebirth and karma play in the development of human society? And is it true that we don't need Indian cosmological beliefs or something transcendental, and instead just rely on modern secular scientific views? And it's interesting, writing and reflecting on these, there's a very interesting BBC Radio 4 program. It's kind of a podcast called Sideways. I don't know if any of you know Sideways. If you get a chance, go onto the BBC iPlayer, and it's Sideways number 68, and the title of the discussion is Bliss is Suffering. Bliss is suffering. And the theme that runs through that is precisely that theme. Can modern science explain transcendental, blissful experiences at times of extreme suffering, or is something else at work? There's a very interesting tension between those two themes in that discussion. And the other thing and a similar theme that's occurred recently for me, is I watched a discussion between Nick Cave, who many of you know has this Red Hand Files and this book Faith, Hope and Carnage, and a man called Tom Holland, who's written a book called Dominion, who's a historian and novelist. Both of them go to a particular Christian church for the atmosphere of the church. Tom Holland outright calls himself a Christian. Nick Cave is much more careful. He talks about having experiences in Christian churches, but doesn't like to say outright, I am a Christian. But they got asked a question: what happens when we die? And their answers were very, very interesting. Tom Holland, the guy who says, I am a Christian, can't let go of his secular belief that when he dies, that's it. For him, he can't let go of that. That's gone. He says he had a cancer operation recently. When he had the anesthetic, he counted 10, 9, 8, out he went. Then he woke up later and he said, when I went out, he said, that's what happens when I die. Nick Cave then said, I'm not prepared to say that. I don't know. I want to leave it open. Maybe something more happens. So the guy who isn't prepared to call himself a Christian is open to more sort of transcendental experience. And I found that very interesting. So there's something there, I think, for you to talk about. Do you wish for there to be a just universe? Do you wish for there to be justice somehow? And does that influence your beliefs? And is the secular, scientific, naturalist vision of life enough for you? Or do you long for something beyond, especially when it comes to the question of what happens when we die? And I'll finish there.
Got a few minutes for questions. That's great. Thank you very, very much. Will you just lead this part? You don't need me to do.
Yeah, well, let's just see if anybody.
Yeah, Vaddhaka. I mean, you don't have to answer it in any length, but does Stephen Batchelor sort of make any efforts to be a bit more particular about the vision that he has that secular modernity provides something as effective a vision?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of argumentation in his book After Buddhism. To be fair to him, he does go into quite a lot of issues. Yes, he says that a sense of awe that you get from nature and from the cosmos and so on, and the feeling of connection that you have is enough. He doesn't have a sense, my take on it is he doesn't have a sense of the transcendental. He talks about enlightenment as being a different way of viewing how you are in this world now. And he doesn't sort of see it in any way as a mystery. Whereas I think Sankarachita opens it up, sort of talking about, don't pin down what enlightenment is. It may be the end of suffering, maybe this, that, or the other, but there's a mystery. Something else is possible. And that, I think, is the crux of his argument. That he can't see the transcendental. Secular Buddhists don't go for that kind of thing. That's why they're not really into ritual and pujas and stuff like that as a way of evoking that side of things. So it's a broad sense, but he does put quite a lot of specific arguments. So he contends, for example, he does argue quite in detail that there is no scientific evidence of rebirth.
Okay.
Yeah. He's a good writer, and it's good to be provoked to think very carefully by him. Yeah. Yes.
Well, firstly, thank you. I feel like you give us each week, you're giving us kind of, I always think death is a bit of an art, and I feel like you're giving us lots of pastel colours for our palette. So thank you. I was just wondering about if there's anything that you've come across which points to lots of the time in the groups I've been in, which were really interesting. People we've talked about this connection with somebody who has passed. And people feeling, you know, I know I've had it myself, but I mean, communication with somebody, with something like that. And I just wondered if there's any, you know, if there's any pointing towards those types of experience. Did the Buddha have those sorts of experiences? Do we know? Do we envisage that he might?
It may be stylized, it may be written into the suttas at a later stage, but of course the Buddha does talk about previous Buddhas and their lives, and you've got the Jataka tales, which purportedly are previous lives of the Buddha in some ways. I can only sort of approach this from a sort of personal point of view, which is, I've always thought of myself, I was brought up as a Marxist revolutionary materialist, for goodness sake. But then I find myself talking to somebody about practicing the Metabhavana, and in the fifth stage, I always bring in my father and mother and aunts and uncles and others who've died. And I find myself saying to them, I'm absolutely convinced, I've no way of knowing this, that they receive that metta and that it matters to them. Now, how can I say that? There's some sort of like sense, an intuition or imagination or whatever, something important there is going on. And I'm really taken by, when I was in Birmingham, at the Birmingham Buddhist Centre, I was asked to go and teach meditation at a spiritualist church. And the people there were absolutely amazing. They had all sorts of spiritual connections with other people and so on. And all of them had been alone, thinking there was something desperately unusual, that they were freaks. And when they stumbled across this church, the great joy of realizing that others had these beliefs. And I was really moved by it. And that sort of spiritualist church, there's quite a lot of them around in working class areas in the Midlands and in the north of England. And I'm glad that those kinds of things are there. So it's a little bit off your question in a way, but that's my personal experience. I think, yes, spiritualist churches are good places.
Yeah.
I thought one interpretation of rebirth is that every moment we change.
Yes.
We have a rebirth of ourselves. Is that also kind of spiritualist, secularist, Buddhist?
Yes, Stephen Batchelor would argue that's the point, that all of the Buddhist teachings are actually about how we can change ourselves in this life, that you don't have to think about other lives, past lives or future lives. It's you actually concentrate the teaching into just this life. And when this life finishes, that's it. So, but you can, the teachings around the wheel of life, the 6 realms and so on, Chogyam Trungpa and Francis Fremantle in their book on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, interpret it very psychologically, which you can do that, and that's fine. If that helps you in this life, that's great. That's great. But, the argument is that we are continually making and remaking ourselves in this life, and maybe that continues in some sort of future rebecomings. But it doesn't have to necessarily be so for it to be a really important teaching here and now. And that's what Bhikkhu Analayo says, whether you believe in rebirth or not, that's what matters. That's what you can do now. So that's the lesson I take from it. Yeah.
Well, it's a good place to end, actually, because that's all we've got, really, hasn't it? We've just got this, we've just got now, haven't we? We've just got what we can do now. So thank you.
Can I just say about next week, briefly?
Please.
So next week we'll be looking at different things like the phenomenon of tulkus. These are the reincarnation lamas, near-death experiences, and 1 or 2 other things as well. So I'll be looking at different aspects of other considerations for and against the idea of rebirth. That's next week.
Great. And can you give us the 2 questions again?
So my hang on, let me just check. Do you wish for there to be a just universe, and does that affect how you approach the idea of rebirth and karma? And is the secular, scientific, naturalist vision of life enough for you? Or do you long for something beyond that, especially as it relates to what happens when we die?
Oh, great. Well, they're 2 really great questions to take into our groups. Thank you again, Vaddhaka. If you haven't seen the first 2 talks, you haven't been here for a few weeks, get on the Buddhist Centre YouTube and catch up. But they're really, really good. Thank you, Vaddhaka.
Thank you.
Again.